According to our series of live interviews with various people, today we're joined by John Bird, the co-founder of The Big Issue. Nearly 24 years ago.
23 years ago on the 11th of September last, 9/11, 1991. And we're in our 24th year now.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us. So we want to talk to you about The Big Issue, of course. It's something that many people know about, but can you just give us a brief of what it is at the moment?
Well, it was started in order to stop homeless people getting into trouble, because a lot of them were filling the streets of cities like London, and they didn't get any support, and they were begging, sometimes aggressively. A lot of them had drink and drug problems, social problems, mental health problems. Some of them were shoplifting, some of them were breaking into cars, and even worse things than that. And we came along in September 91 and said, look, if you've got drink and drug problems and you're robbing people or, you know, aggressively begging in order to feed your habits, why not work with The Big Issue? And then at least the only person you're harming is yourself, not members of the public. And by that, decriminalizing them. So we started as a kind of crime prevention program in the centre of London, and then we moved out to other parts of the UK and other parts of the world. So it was very, very specifically about getting people out of trouble. It's grown since then. Now we do a lot more. Now we try and move people off the streets. Now we try and get people into detox rehabs. We try and get them into therapeutic communities. We try and get them into other forms of work. But it did start, and I think the essential nature of it is it was an attempt at decriminalizing the poverty that existed in the streets. You've also got to remember that in 1991, when we started, there was thousands of homeless people sleeping in the streets of London alone. Thousands. You went along the Strand, the Aldwych, you went down to Waterloo, you went to Lincoln's Inn Field, you went further out, you went into the parks. There were people sleeping rough. A lot of them very, very young people, getting involved in things like rent boying in order to feed themselves, rent girls, selling drugs in order to make money. So there was a real issue. So when people say now, there's this kind of idea that we're living in this terrible world, I think I have to say, look, let's just use a bit of memory on this. We're not back to 1990, 1991. We may be heading that way again, but let's kind of understand why we're heading that way again and what happened back in 1991 to bring about this change. And, you know, I could go on about that forever. Can I just make a few points as I go along?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, feel free.
I watched Russell Brand, a very popular young man, on the Paxman show. He did a show with Paxman, or he did a video with Paxman, in which he said that all the parties were the same, all the parties were incapable of doing anything which is good for us, and he really poo-pooed the whole idea of voting. I won't go into the argument that it took hundreds of years to get the vote. I will go into the argument of the fact that the vote doesn't work is because we've abused it, and the reason we've abused it is we've left politics to people. I would not call them arseholes, but other people will. We've left them. We've left.
Keep the profanities.
Yeah, yeah. There's the first and only one, and they've kind of kept. You know, we've abused what was a great inheritance. That's one thing. Secondly, if you look at the nature of governments, it was Tony Blair's government, and he had many reasons to be disliked. It was him who put an enormous amount of money into getting people off the streets and getting them into housing and getting them into work. That's why we don't have the big battalions of homeless people on the street. It was because of the administration of Mr. Blair. So when somebody like Russell Brand comes along and says, don't vote, I think what he's saying really is giving up on the poor, because the poor are the ones who are beholden to the government en masse to do these big movements in society that enable us to remove homeless people from the streets and give them an alternative to begging and giving them an alternative to street living. I never got on with Blair. I don't like Blair, didn't like what he did in Iraq and places like that. But the thing is, he did use his political power to bring about some seismic changes around homelessness. The fact that we're going back there also means that we have to look at what went wrong and why probably what Blair did wasn't enough.
Okay, so Russell Brand. Ironically, yeah. we have an interview with Russell Brand. I think it's a week on Monday. So
let's hope he listens.
We'll put that towards him and get his response from that, because that'll be quite interesting to hear. Obviously, if anyone out there's got any questions, just send them in down the side of this video or tweet us at Truthloader. We'll ping them over to John as and when they come in. But going back to the current situation, so for 23 years the big issue has been in existence, but the success of it, if you like, it kind of very much mirrors your own circumstances in regards to where you grew up, the situation you grew up with, and how you came out of that and created the big issue. And that seems to me like a kind of thing that many of the vendors should go by. I mean, do you think you'd agree with that, as opposed to coming out of something that...
Well, yeah, I mean, the reason I started the big issue with money from a guy called Gordon Roddick, who, with his wife Anita Roddick, had started the Body Shop. Our development did not take place in the world of charity. It started in the world of consumerism, the peppermint foot lotion revolution, as it was once referred to. The reason I did it was largely because I understood homelessness. I had been born into a London Irish family in Notting Hill, where we were incredibly poor, where there was a lot of violence, a lot of wife beating, a lot of poverty, rats, sharing toilets with 12 families, homeless at 5, homeless again at 6, in a Catholic orphanage in care until I was 10, and then out on the streets, shoplifting, housebreaking, stealing cars, doing whatever I could, being banned from school, and being a very, very terrible young boy, starting fires. And when I eventually got sorted out, which took me into my probably late 20s, early 30s, I kind of felt I'd been to the edge of the abyss and looked over. So it made me very itchy. What could I do with my life experience? I'd moved from absolute poverty into the middle classes, went to concerts and art shows and all that. So I became a kind of posh git. And was very, very aware of the fact that I had no education, so I educated myself, and then realized that I had to do something with all of this experience. I didn't want it thrown away. When I was dead, I didn't want people to say, well, there was a wasted opportunity of somebody who had been a part of a problem morphing into being a part of a solution. So really, in the way that life sometimes works, I was in my late 30s, beginning to get into my 40s, and I was really hungry. I'd become a printer. I'd been married on 2 occasions. I had 2 families. I was printing and designing and doing all sorts of stuff like that, working for some charities in and around homelessness. And then I re-met this guy, Gordon Roddick, who I hadn't met when I was 21, sleeping on the street. Well, I was sofa surfing in Edinburgh, and sometimes sleeping on the streets if I couldn't get a sofa at the age of 21, looking just like Russell Brand. We all look like Russell Brand in 1969, 1970.
I feel that a theme will come back.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, fine.
Well, every time I look at him, he reminds me of me when I was 21. And why was it there were 500 of us walking down the King's Road, Chelsea? Anyway, so I was there in Edinburgh, and I met this big-nosed Scotsman. I had a big nose, I had a broken nose, and he had a broken nose, and we became friends. Didn't see him for 20 years, and he had morphed into this multi-millionaire with his wife, Anita Roddick, having started the Body Shop. And I thought, wow. So I went to see him, and after a few years, he was in New York, saw a guy selling a street paper, decided he wanted to try it over here, and asked me to do it. And I got on with it, and it was my making. You know, when people say, you know, I had this guy the other day come up to me, big Scotsman, used the Big Issue 20 years ago to get out of grief. He was doing drugs and drink, stealing and all that, and we got him out of thieving, and now he's a consultant, works with hospitals and all sorts of things like that, and he's got a degree. And he said to me, the Big Issue made me. And I said, well, it made me as well, because I would have just drifted into whatever. But it gave me a purpose. It got me concentrated. It got me angry about some of the things and thoughtful about other things. So I'm a product of the Big Issue revolution, in the same way as my Scottish friend is, who's now a consultant in Harley Street.
Calling it the Big Issue it's a big statement, isn't it? I mean, how did that particular name come up?
Well, it didn't go down very well. I mean, nobody in the Body Shop, when I went down, I said, I'm going to call it the Big Issue. And he said, no, call it like the American paper, Street News, be specific. And I said, well, no. I said, because I don't want to do a paper which is about homelessness, which what Street News was. It was written by homeless people, for homeless people, and then it sold it to the public. And homelessness is a very esoteric, specialist thing. Not everybody's interested in it. And I said what I wanted to do was do a magazine that everybody wanted to read. The revolutionary thing or the radical thing was in it, was not in what the magazine was. It was in the way that it was distributed by homeless people who were learning to earn their own money and get out of the grief. So I wanted to call it the Big Issue, because everybody has a big issue. The big issue might be muscular dystrophy, it might be homophobia, it might be gypsies, it might be the arts, it might be prisons. And I love the idea of calling it something as general as that.
But why didn't you call it something to do with homeless? Because I
didn't want a ghetto for homeless people. I wanted people to come to us, sell the magazine, earn as much money as possible, and then exit as soon as they could. The name The Big Issue came to me in a dream. I always have these weird dreams. I solve lots of my problems when I'm dreaming. I had a dream last night about a book I've got to write about Margaret Thatcher. And I've been sketching it all morning and I will do it, because my dreams are informative. And I had this dream in the summer of '91, couldn't come up with the idea of a street paper name, we didn't even call it and then I had this dream, and it was, call it the Big Issue. I don't know if it was an angel or a devil, or whether it was an atheist or a co-religionist. Anyway, and so I woke up in the morning and said, right, we're going to call it the Big Issue. And then people didn't like it, but the public loved it. The public just, why'd you call it the Big Issue? It's a brilliant name.
So 23 years on, nearly 24 years on, it's hugely successful. There are a lot of vendors out on the streets. It's a part of society. When you in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, but you see, there's two sides to the Big Issue which you don't see. One is the fact that it's totally and utterly changed virtually all homeless organisations, because 23 years ago, homeless organisations largely gave handouts to poor people and kind of patted them on the head and said, "Oh, you poor person," and all that. So what it was the kind of good-intentioned do-gooder giving to the poor, you know, a bit like St. Francis of Assisi or something like that. And we came along and said, no, 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 unless you involve the poor, the homeless in their own redemption, unless you gave them responsibility, unless you gave them the chance to grow up. The thing about poverty, it makes you very juvenile, it makes you very dependent, it pushes you down, it destroys you. There's nothing noble about poverty. Or if there was, I never came across any of it. So what we do is we try and get them to grow up. So, but now if you go to homeless organisations, they all talk about self-help, they all talk about people growing. So so the big issue, if it was to die tomorrow, has totally, radically revolutionised the way that we deal with giving and the way we deal with poverty and the way we deal with homelessness. The other thing is that what started on the double yellow lines of the West End of London is now everywhere, from Tokyo to Totnes, from Johannesburg to St. Petersburg. It's all over the place, and it's all based on the very, very simple principle that Gordon Roddick and I came up with, which is a hand up, not a hand out. It is absolutely revolutionary. I have said on occasions that when I'm brown bread and Gordon's brown bread, they'll rename most of the streets in the centre of London. Trafalgar Square will be called Bird Square, and Westminster Parliament Square will be called Roddick Square, because we have challenged that very idea that you have the people who have the money and the comfort handing out their largesse to people. What we've said, you've got to mix them up. You've got to break the ghetto. You've got to begin to see people as your equal. When somebody sells you the big issue, they're not your inferior. You're not, you know, you're not buying a box of matches off them like they did after the First World War. You're not, oh, you know, you're looking at an equal and you're talking to that person and you're identifying them, and on many, many occasions you are involving yourself in their lives. The amount of people who've become self-appointed social workers and got homeless people off the streets because we have introduced them in a really interesting way, which is selling on the streets.
I want to come to the kind of the language of homelessness as well, because there are strains and there are situations and how you might be affected by it. But I just want to ask you, if you go on social media and if you search big issue, if you search what people are saying about it, generally the majority of people are saying they're saying good things about it. They're talking about the people that they've sell the big issue on the corner of their street where they live, or you know, just next to where they work, and they have a chat with them and they hear their stories, and you know, they're just somebody that is part of their everyday life. But when you also go on one of your Twitter accounts and you see postings which talk about debunking myths, it kind of gives the impression that there is still a lot of prejudice out there. I mean, do you think that is fair? It's fair to say that there are parts of society who still prejudice against big issue sellers?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you'll ever get rid of prejudice, and I don't know whether you should ever even bother. I think the important thing is the proof of the pudding is in the eating. When you get, for instance, a Romanian who everybody's frightened of, these Romanians coming over here, when you get a Romanian who in the city of Bath jumps into the river fully clothed and rescues a child and then gets up and then walks on, a big issue vendor walks on and everybody's looking for him, that in a sense explodes the myth that they're all some kind of stealers of our copper wiring on the railway line. When you meet Romanians who work from the first thing in the morning till the last thing at night selling papers, then you realize that the myths get debunked. Then you hear just before last Christmas a Romanian person selling the big issue to a blind woman, and then the blind woman opens her purse and he sees 50 quid and steals it, you then know that that's the real world. There are pluses and there are minuses. One step forward, two steps back. Somebody will take the reputation of Romanians, of the poor, of the homeless, of the big issue, and wrap it up and throw it away, and other people will rescue it. And that, unfortunately, is going to be going on every day and every night. I mean, I always say you're only as good as the anecdotes you choose to believe. If you're a Guardian reader, then you read you pick your anecdotes very, very carefully. And if you find an anecdote that contradicts the anecdotes that you've already got, then you don't reject. If you're a Daily Mail reader, you read you pick and choose. You want to read about the Romanian who's stolen the money from the blind woman. You don't want to hear about the Romanian who jumps into the river and saves the life of a child. You don't want to hear all these sorts of things. So you're only as good as the anecdotes you choose to believe. And that is a constant battle to, in a sense, say, let's go beyond the anecdotes. Let's try and make an understanding that we all begin to learn how history works, how social society works, how immigration works, all these sorts of things. And that, I don't think you're ever going to lose that battle, and likewise, you're never going to win it.
What other myths are there surrounding the big issue and vendors and what the organisation does?
Well, there's a lot of myths. There's myths. I mean, I keep running into myths where I get stories from readers who say, oh, I know this particular vendor and you've treated them very badly, and it's disgusting the way that you treat the vendor. And then we look into it and we find that the vendor's done something wrong, so we've had to suspend them or something like that. So there's a lot of myths around that. Then again, we get people who will glorify the big issue and describe me as a saintly person. One of the things about me is I'm far from saintly. I'm a person who has a drink problem, doesn't have a drug problem anymore, has an aggression problem. I'm not the kind of person that you want to dress up. But every now and then, I read the press about me, and sometimes I'm an absolute evil person, or I'm a saint. And I think all those things are suffered every day in the streets when homeless people are treated as saints or sinners, and they are neither. Most of us are not saints or sinners. We are a little bit of mixture of both. So there is a mythology. I think there's also some guy wrote to me the other day saying it was too left-wing. It was too knee-jerky liberal. Then, not very long after, I got another email from somebody saying that we were too viciously right-wing, and we'd had David Cameron as a guest editor, and that was because John Bird was after a lordship. Well, there's no way a Tory's going to give me a lord, because I'm not reliable. Whether I say I'm reliable, that's one thing. But they say all this kind of stuff. So there's always this throwing around of titles and epithets and all that, whether you're an angel or a saint, a Tory, a label. I mean, I was on Question Time earlier this year, and David Dimbleby said to me, "Oh, it is rumoured that you are a working class Tory." And I said, yeah, the problem is they didn't finish the sentence. I'm a working class Tory with Marxist, Leninist and Engels tendencies. And of course, that was what I was saying. I'm saying you can't put me in any category. I think the real problem that we have is that people still don't quite understand what we're doing. Not everybody, but there's too many of them out there who write to me and say, I didn't realise the vendors bought the paper and sold it. I didn't realise that what you try and do is get them off the streets. I didn't realise that some of them will never get off the streets or will never move on to being an eye surgeon at St Thomas's Hospital or whatever. So there's all these kind of myths, and it's quite difficult clearing that up.
So let's talk about that, because obviously on the streets, the thing you see is a vendor selling the big issue. But what, as you say, what you don't see is the thing that happens behind. So what,
or the reasons why they came onto the streets.
Exactly. So what is it? What is the other stuff that you do behind the scenes to help them off the street into housing? And then is there like a kind of after-sale service, if you like? There's
a pre-sale and after-sale. One of them is that what we do, well, there's a number of things that we do. One of them is that we do something immediate. We try and get them buddied up if they're on their own. We try and get them buddied with other people. We try and get them in if they need detox and rehab. We try and get them connected up with that. Unfortunately, the vast majority want to do their own thing, so they're there because they're individuals. So probably only between 5 and 8 or 10% of them actually want to use the services. But the services may help them get housed. It certainly, if they, you know, we'll buy stuff for them. I'm very, very interested in developing the rehab and the detox side of things. I'm in discussions with creating a new program where we can take vendors off the streets who have severe mental health problems around drink and drugs and put them into a therapeutic community and put them after a detox and a rehab. So we're about to probably launch within the next 6 months to a year a program with a leading psychologist who has got a community, and it will mean that our vendors can go in and they won't have to pay, and the state won't have to pay, because they'll work their living. They'll do the gardening, they'll do the bricklaying, or they'll do all the other things. A lot of our vendors have all sorts of skills, so it's a bit like being singing. You sing for your song, or you sing for your supper. Those kind of things. I'm very, very interested in saying to people, look, we'll get you into this process, and on the basis that you make a contribution as well, and you're not just laying there like a patient. So that's the kind of thing that I'm interested in. But in a very, very minor sort of way, we try and get them moved on. We try and get them into work if they want to get into work. But I think, to be quite honest, a lot of the people that we work with have been around for a long time. They've been in a lot of the other organizations. They've been through the revolving door, in homelessness, out of homelessness, and back in again. And I think a lot of the things that we have to recognize is that the big issue is a bit of a family to them, because they don't have their own family. So those are the kind of immediate things. In other areas beyond that circle, we're trying to change and influence the way that the government spends its social money. So what we try and do is we try and get investment into social change. We started something about 10 years ago, and it took us about 5 years to kind of get it going, called Big Issue Invest, which is about a program that prevents people from ending up on the streets. We work on this principle, which is called the PEC principle. PEC is prevention, emergency, coping, and cure. Nearly all of the big money, especially social money, is spent in emergency and coping. Very little spent on cure and very little spent on prevention. We started the Big Issue Invest in order to get high net worth individuals' money, which we could then put into programs that stop people becoming the next generation of big issue vendors. So we now work preventing people becoming big issue vendors, and then we try and help them in the emergency, we try and help them in the coping, and then we try and move them on into the cure.
And how is that sort of panning out? I mean, because
it's panning out very difficult because, well, the prevention's working very well. The emergency, you know, where we work with people in need, the coping, the stabilization. The real thing is that there's not the money and there's not much of an opportunity to move them on to the cure. So what has tended to happen, if you revisit what I said about Tony Blair, what happened with Blair, Blair got them off the streets, put shed loads of money into homeless organizations, got them into social housing. Unfortunately, got them into social social housing, but did not give them the therapeutic help, the mental health help, so that they then could morph out of dependency. So what has often happened is that people have got into social housing and they vegetated there. So I'm describing an impractical conclusion to something which is very practical. So most governments will take the poor on a journey, and it's a bit like going from A to Z, but they kind of leave them about M or N. And this is what the Blair government did with their program, and this is what this government is doing. It's not taking people, you know, it's like getting people off of social security, but where? Into what work? What investments are being made in some of the poorest people in society, who are also some of the most expensive people in society in terms of costing the taxpayer? What are they doing about moving them on? And that part of the equation is not worked on.
There's a couple of interesting things there to come out of it. I mean, one of the things I was going to ask you, which was just kind of a statement, not sure it's particularly coined by anyone, but you know, homelessness, is it just a result of the failure of society?
Oh, well, everything's the result of the failure of society and not the result of the failure of society. It's one of those kind of weird things. I mean, my homelessness was based on a number of conditions to do with under-education, under-opportunity, combined with the fact that my mum and dad weren't very good at looking after money, and they should never have had 6 children, 6 boys, and should never have brought up so many people in need. So there's a kind of number of personal responsibilities mixed with global things. The fact that British capitalism has never really added up to much since the time of Victoria. The fact that if you look at a lot of the homelessness that came in the 80s and the 90s, it came because Margaret Thatcher closed down virtually all of the traditional industries that had been kept on a subsidy since the First World War, and would, if it wasn't for the First World War, those subsidies wouldn't have existed, and these industries would have closed down a lot longer. But they were artificially kept alive in the 20s and the 30s. They were needed in the 40s for the First World War, Second World War, and then afterwards they increasingly were irrelevant to the prosperity of Britain. All these sorts of historical things. The fact that we had an empire, which meant that most people would invest in short-term gains in the empire rather than building new industries like the Germans did. The Germans were the most powerful industrial base in the world before the First World War, because they invested in new technology, while we were, well, not we, but the upper classes and the investing classes were investing in making money out of goods, out of commodity goods, and were making money out of tea and rubber, but not making money out of developing new industry. All sorts of stuff like that. So if you look at society, it's kind of made up of lots of bits of history, lots of bits of personal responsibility, and lots of bits of very, very crass thinking on the behalf of governments, who every now and then kind of get it right. So back to the Russell Brand saying don't vote. I can understand why you say that, but we've got to change politics by getting involved in it. But the other thing, politicians can really determine how many poor there are and whether they get a way out of poverty, but they can also determine whether or not you create the kind of education and the social opportunity so that people don't have to stay poor. Blair moved the esoteric world of people going to the university into an enormous mass. He created all these universities. I know that people have laughed at a lot of them and said that they're not real universities, but that's not the point. What he did was he opened up the sluice gates for education amongst working class people, amongst lower middle class people, and all that sort of stuff. So politicians can have an enormous influence on it all. Overall, society is us, but let's not beat ourselves up because we're not doing such a good job. Let's involve ourselves in politics. Let's move from being a representational form of democracy where we leave everything to people who we don't trust and believe in, into a participatory democracy. I would say to anybody who says don't vote, I'd say vote, but get involved in the parties. If you don't like the policies of get involved in the parties. Change the parties from within or build new parties.
I mean, going back there, I mean, from a society's point of view, I mean, is it fair to say one way of looking at the big issue is that it was a solution to a big problem back in the early 90s and has obviously done successfully well for a vast number of people. And there are lots of other charities out there doing similar things for other people in different situations, helping them along, helping them better their lives and extend their lives. But it's the fact that your organisation came about from your own personal experiences to help those people is as a social responsibility thing. Is that your responsibility, or is it a government's responsibility? Because I suppose what I'm saying is that shouldn't it be the government who takes this on more?
It depends on how you see the government. I mean, if you see the government as the supplier of all solutions, and there are a lot of people who do, then you might actually follow that line. But if you're like me, a critic of government, a person who has tried everything. I've tried everything from, you know, I've been a racist, you know, a Nazi racist, anti-Semitic and all that sort of stuff, a Catholic. I've tried Marxism, I've tried the right wing, the left wing and all that stuff. When you kind of come to a conclusion, and I've come to the conclusion that most of it is really putting you into these kind of ideological blinkers, then you tend to look at governments in a different way. The thing about governments is they're quite good at emergencies. If you fall down a hole, they'll dig you out. But once you're out of the hole and you say, oh, look, I need social security or I need some education, they say, no, 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 no. So they give you social security, which is a very small amount of money, ties you up and warehouses you. But when it comes to giving you education and social opportunity, they're not particularly good at that. If you look at the prison system, when I was in the prison system, you know, 80% of people who went in bad came out better because they were redeemed, they were reformed. Now it's 90% of people go in bad, they come out worse because they're not reformed, because the prison system doesn't work. That's governments doing it in a very, very ham-fisted sort of way. I question governments. I don't think you should leave governments to decide family things like how you and I bring up our children. I don't think government should be allowed to write off a whole section of the community as they have done. Margaret Thatcher, when she closed down the basic industries, when she was asked by Lord Willie Whitelaw, what do you do with nearly 1 million people who you've laid off? And she says, let them have benefit. So benefit was used as a kind of cheap option of saying goodbye, come back when you're dead. And that's exactly where the distortions of the social security system gets in. That's why there are so many people who are tied up, members of my own family, who are tied up in social security, who can't break out of it. So those are governments, and therefore you wouldn't leave them to do some of the kind of nuances. I'm a great believer in the big society. We invented the big society in 2001. Mr. Cameron didn't invent it when he got into power. We invented it. A lot of us were inventing it. We're saying, bring the problem back to the community. Let local people sort the problem out. Let's sort out as many problems as possible. Let's leave the big issues, like the amount of money you spend on education. Let's leave that back to the ballot box. But let's do as much as we can, as locally as possible, whether that's in a church, a mosque, a synagogue, a chapel, a scout hall, a university. Let's bring all of as many of the solutions back to the community.
So in a nutshell, irrespective of each political party that's on the scene at the moment, what should a government be doing now to help solve this issue?
Well, the one thing this government has never done, and the government before, and the government before, and the government before, you know, back into the dim and distant, dusty times of history, is they haven't really done an awful lot of joined-up thinking. They haven't really stepped back. And
what do you mean by that? I mean, that's a kind of phrase, but...
Joined-up thinking, I mean, for instance, if you look at the... I'll give you a very simple example that in the area that I live, they closed the youth clubs down because the government said that the local authorities couldn't have as much money as they had before, closed the youth clubs down, crime increases, antisocial behaviour increases, and the police bill goes up. And actually, if you work it out, all you've done is pass the problem on to another department. If you look at, for instance, the National Health Service, when I was born 2 years before the creation of the National Health Service, in the early years of the National Health Service, it spent 30% of its budget on prevention, which meant going round, educating, telling people, don't do this, do this, get this exercise, eat this, you know, drink this milk, have these capsules, have a full nutritional meal. And so because they didn't have the money, with the passage of time, the National Health Service has shrunk in providing prevention. You go to the National Health Service now because you're sick. It's not a national health service, it's a national, I'll get you back to health service when your health has collapsed. So therefore there's no prevention. Prevention is the best form of cure. So you've got this, the biggest business in Britain is the National Health Service, but it's not run by anybody who's sensible. You get people who end up in the A&E department who are then put out back into dreadful conditions, which means that their illnesses will carry on. There's none of this kind of stepping back and saying, let's make sure that each department works correctly. When I went to see Mr. Cameron before he became the mayor, not the mayor, what is it, the Prime Minister of England, I think he'd just become the leader of the Conservative Party, and I asked him how much it cost to produce him, how much did his family have to spend to make this posh geezer to run this party for posh people. And I said, I thought it was probably about $350,000. He said, no, it was about $250,000. They'd worked it all out, all those kind of, you know, going out on the clay, on the moors, shooting clay pigeons or whatever they do, and all those holidays and university and Eton, $250,000. I said, you know, we've just done a survey of our vendors, and we did a survey in London, a couple of hundred vendors. 87% of them had been in local authority care for over 10 years. That's £2,000, £3,000 a week. That's £100,000 a year. That's £1 million. So it costs more to produce the poorest person than the most exalted person. That's a madness. Why are we spending this ridiculous amount of money? The money's there, we're just throwing it away. Why, for instance, are we allowing people like Serco and all these big businesses to become agents? So what you do is you break off a bit of the local government and you give it to somebody on the basis that they will reduce your costs, whether it's the libraries, whether it's the, even in government, they're doing it everywhere. So you give it to somebody like Serco or Group 4 or something like that, they immediately cut the staff, they immediately cut the service, and they immediately reduce the costs, and they take over all sorts of things, and you go thumbs up. But if you look at it, the amount of damage is enormous. The damage to society when you have these agents, when you have these weird things where somebody could be working, two people could be working on the railway, one of them working for an agent and getting £8 an hour, and one of them working for the railway and getting £12 an hour, because somebody's taking there's a growth of these enormous businesses which are just sucking the blood blood out of working people and sucking the blood out. And all of this is done, goes back to the days Blair brought all this stuff in, Brown ran with it, and Cameron's running with it. All these kind of, so what you really need is you need almost to step back and say, back to the drawing board. Let's design government so that it doesn't keep making problems for itself. Why is it that if you and I were to go into an intensive care unit, they will spend thousands of pounds on saving our lives, but then if we go into the toilets, we may catch RSM or MRS or whatever, one of those diseases? Why is it that you've got those big contradictions? Enormous amount of money spent on you in one area and nothing in another. Why is it that we don't invest in, I would invest in the most abject people in society, the people who are getting into trouble, whose families are not supporting the children, you know, through drink and drugs. I would spend an enormous amount of money on those to get them out of poverty, because if you don't, they're going to be with you forever and they're going to be costing you maybe £100,000 a year for the next 30 years.
Okay, we're live with John Bird, founder of The Big Issue. If you want your questions, just ping them in. We're getting a few in at the moment, so we're going to ask you them now. But it's, when you were talking about where the money needs to be spent, could you just like imagine like a pictogram? Like, where does the money flow to? In your head, where should the money flow to?
I would say in
government.
I would say that I think the money has to go back to the communities. I think what the government has done is quite a ridiculous thing, which is to strip the lifeblood out of the communities. If, for instance, in Norfolk, if you are mentally ill in Norfolk, then it was probably better to be mentally ill 3, 4, 5 years ago, because now there's very little prevention, support. So you could be going mad in Norfolk, and there's absolutely nothing there for you. If you look at, you go down to Cornwall, I was down in Cornwall recently, you look at the kind of support for old people. So what happens is you don't support the old people, so they end up in intensive care, they're there, and they cost thousands of pounds, because what you've done is you've said, let's just ignore it. So instead of keeping them alive, keeping them healthy by having the workers there, they don't do it. I was one of the few people who said that they should, this is not the time for austerity. When the Tories came in, I wrote a paper in which I said that the problem with austerity is it costs too much money. The amount of damage done by the austerity responses of this government, which can pat itself on the back because it's reduced the budget, reduced the debt, is quite enormous. What I would have done is I would have borrowed the money. And you could borrow money when money was cheaper. Money's been cheaper for governments, cheaper than since 1792. Since the time of the French Revolution. They could have borrowed the money and used the money to you know, to keep the communities together. When people are losing their jobs, when your life expectancy, you know, the quality of your life is going down, that's when you need the community. The government should be investing in new forms of social business, should be investing in social enterprises and all that stuff. Why would you, if you want to run your prisons, and I would like to run a prison, I wouldn't give it to Serco, I'd give it to somebody like me, or a social enterprise like me, and I would run it in such a way that all of the profits went back into the community and those sorts of things. So there are many, many interesting ways in which you could do it. But leaving it the way that they've done it, so that what you've got is you just cut. And now we are an unhealthier, we are a more confused community than we were before the crisis, and we've been made more confused because the government has not borrowed their way out of the crisis, which is how you get out of a crisis. How did America move from the 1930s, where the Hungry 30s, after the collapse of Wall Street in 1929. How did they didn't get out. They had their New Deal, which didn't do an awful lot. Then they had the Second World War. The American economy expanded by 300%. How did they do that? They borrowed up to the hilt. They borrowed, they passed the cost on to the generations to come, my generation. Because what you do is, if you hit a hole, you borrow from the future in order to make the world better now and build the communities and build the businesses so that then there is more prosperity in subsequent generations. The reason you have Elvis Presley, the reason you have all of those people, the reason you have youth culture is largely because Hitler had a go at Poland, had a go at the Jews, had a go at all those people. The Americans jumped in, the Japanese jumped in, and all sorts of things. And out of all that catastrophe came Elvis Presley, the Beatles, all of the post-war prosperity. And that was got because America borrowed more money than it ever had. And we should have declared war against austerity back in 2010, instead of being limp-wristed and doing the usual thing, which is to make the poorest in society pay for the mistakes made by the richest.
Okay, let's go to some questions from those who are watching. We've got a question from Lucy via Twitter. I
don't think I'm going to do this again because they haven't given me any water. My throat's going.
What do you see as a current gap in the market that could be filled with new social enterprises?
I would. One of the biggest areas is around education.
Yep.
One of the biggest areas is around the supply. What the government is doing is privatising, and I would say rather than privatise, take some of those projects and make them socialised by moving them into social enterprises. Around government, there's an enormous amount of opportunity. Around the National Health Service, because what they're trying to do is try and keep the costs down, and I think one of the ways you can do that and improve the services around social enterprise. There's an enormous area around there. I also think very, very strongly that we need to wake up to the power that you and I and the listeners or what viewers have, which is the power to bring about social change through purchase, through buying. If you look at it, in 2011, largely because I think, and I'm not the only one, because of all the Occupy stuff, a lot of people got cheesed off with people like Tesco's. So over the Christmas period, Tesco's lost £5 billion worth of footfall. So people didn't go to Tesco's. So what happened was, ever since then, Tesco's has never got over it. Their share prices fell by 19%, which is catastrophic to these people. And it was largely because people said, look, I'm here, I'm one of a zillion number of people, and I'm going to converge my energies and not shop there. When we talk about the gap between rich and poor, the gap between rich and poor is growing, largely because of consumerism. Virtually all of the people who are billionaires have passed through the marketplace, and it's where you and I and your girlfriend, boyfriend, brother and sister, mother and father, my children, have gone into the marketplace and made billionaires out of people like Steve Jobs, Richard Branson, and all sorts of things. So therefore, rather than chastising ourselves for creating this gap between rich and poor, why don't we create new means of social distribution? When Marx said in the end of the 19th century that you will only have social justice and social equality when the workers take over the means of production, I would say that's not quite right. Where the real money now is in distribution. If you look at Tesco's, it's just a big aircraft hangar with everybody else's products. You look at Amazon, Amazon are poodling around now making their own product, but 99% of their product is selling other people's stuff. That's where the money is. Something comes in for £1, you sell it for £3. That's the way, and you only have it overnight. So what we need in the future is vast new ways of social distribution. We need social Tesco's, we need social Amazons, we need social means, and that has to be owned by the people who buy the stuff. It has to be owned by us.
And are these generally sort of, they're smaller sort of organisations as opposed to huge international behemoths?
Behemoths, yes. Yeah, sorry to correct you. You see, I went to a very good public school. It was
I'll let you have that.
Yeah, anyway, no. Yeah, I mean, there's an enormous amount of potential, but somebody's got to plan it all, somebody's got to think it, and somebody's got to recognise you've got to recognise contradiction. I mean, I was with somebody the other day, and they were saying, and this is a contradiction, they were saying, you know, we ought to stop buying crap over Christmas, plastic stuff and all that stuff. And we should have wooden stuff and we should have recycled stuff for Christmas. And that's a brilliant idea. But the people there's two lots of people who get hit if you don't shop at Christmas. The very, very wealthy who own the world, and the very, very poor who work in the factories producing this crap that we buy or our children buy. And if you take that from them, they've got nothing. They're back to feral poverty. So we've got to start learning about contradiction. But one, that if you look at a problem, the problem may... A's the problem, B's the solution, but C's the next problem. And I think what I don't see is much understanding about the central nature of contradiction. Everything we do is a contradiction. Everything in the world is a contradiction. If we don't buy from the supermarkets, then the little people who work at the tills get thrown out of work, and they are the backbone of Britain. They are the little people who combine into something really big. They're family, they are the community. And what we've got to do is we've got to find a way of getting beyond that big contradiction that we are dependent on Branson and jobs and all these people to create work as much as to create product. And I think the only way you can do that is by creating new social means. Let's have some social Amazons. That's what I'm working on. I'm working on social distribution. I'm working on turning the big issue into the biggest marketplace so that thousands of people can get work that isn't demeaning and is not where you cream off the top 10% and stick it into the pocket of somebody who then retires into their gated community.
A question from Jeff Heisenberg, who asks, do you think there's any major difference between the main parties' policies on homelessness?
Well, I try not to be party political because I'm a provider for the poor. And that's, you know, some guy wrote to me and says, oh, you know, you're too soft on the government. And I said, well, you know, I have to work with governments. Governments could destroy my work. I'm a provider for the poor. I don't get their money, but they could put the police on, you know, they could really screw up the way we work in the community. So I have to be a bit soft on whatever government. So whether that was Mr. Major, because I'm there for the poor. I can't say to the big issue events, sorry lads, you can't sell today, but I won a victory with the government. And they'll say, get stuffed. We want our living. We don't care about your principles. So I have to stop all that stuff. But I do believe that the Conservatives have been hemmed in a bit by the Lib Dems. I think the Lib Dems have made them a bit more human than they were, though it's difficult to imagine in some senses them, a lot of people thinking they're very human. I think if the Labour got in, I think there are certain things that they would do which would be pluses and minuses. What I would like is a lot of people saying, what are you going to do for the poor? And most of them are kind of saying the same thing. But I do feel that the next general election should be fought over who is going to lift more people out of poverty, who is going to restore the damage done to our community. I know of countless old folks' homes, youth clubs, all these sorts of things being closed down. I want to know who's going to do that, and that's the kind of questions I would put to them. I would say probably if you really were solely concerned about the poor, you might not want to vote this government back in again. But that's entirely up to you, and I'm not trying to influence you in any way.
Okay. Talking about voting, don't need to go back to Russell Brand.
No, leave Russell alone.
Angus Ramsey asks, what do you think of fake charity scams, and in your opinion, what kind of damage do they do, if any?
Well, I think there's always someone on the fiddle. I used to do it when I was a boy. I collected for refugees when I was 10, and the only refugee I was collecting for was myself, and that was 1956. There's always been, you know, poverty throws up scams. If you look at a lot of the scams, then they're carried out by people who have no money. I'm more concerned about the scams that are carried out by big business and are in, you know, kind of payday loan things. I think it's absolutely appalling. When I was a child, we were into those kind of payday loans, but it was done in a different form. You wanted to buy some clothes or you know, some things for the household goods. You then went to somebody who gave you a check, you then cashed it in a shop, so the shop was decided and all that stuff, and you paid thousands of percent of return. To me, the biggest scams are being done on the poorest in society, and often not also the poorest in society. The other day, I received a letter from Serco because I changed my doctor's surgery, and the letter must have, you know, Serco must have charged the National Health Service for sending this letter. There's all those kind of little scams. There's these big businesses doing services for the public which are not services at all. The really big scams that are carried out around the National Health Service. Do you think you need like more accountability and more transparency? Right. Yeah. And I think the charities are something that will come and go. You know, it's like those letters that there's a factory in Nigeria apparently that produces thousands of thousands begging letters. I mean, I keep getting letters, and I'm sure you do, emails saying they've got, you know, Charlie, your mate Charlie is in the south of France and he's lost all his money, and can you send him 500 quid? There's all those kind of things, and, you know, great, you know, let's stamp on those. But let's worry about the real big, vast amounts of money that have been stolen from us through the National Health Service and the services that are provided. The fact that the tagging, you know, the tagging of prisoners sounds criminal, because Serco and Group 4 were charging the government, you know, £100 million for the service, and a lot of the people were already dead. That kind of stuff. That's where we really should be hauling this government to task. Okay. Alain Atlas asks, well, he's got a statement that basically says... Alice, or was that Alain? Alain. I'm sorry, Alain, I think it's Alain Atlas. Apologies if that was completely wrong. We forgive you. Statement is, humans are valuable, people can basically fund themselves. So what do you think of that? And sorry, the second part of that, we don't need a government. So people can fund themselves, we don't need a government. What do you reckon? Well, I think the government, I think you're right. If we get all the soldiers in line, we get all the cues in line, so to speak. I think the less government in our lives, the better. Though I do feel that there should be occasions around disasters when you need governments. I think there's governments that are really, really necessary when in making sure that the law is upheld, so that everyone is protected and all that. But I think, you know, if we're going, I'm not sure we're going in the right direction, by the way, but if we were going towards in the right direction, we would be advocating the withering away of the state, as Marx talked about and Lenin talked about it. That's not John Lennon, that's the other one. We would look to say, you know, we'll do this, we'll sort it out, as families, as communities, as villages, as towns. I don't see much sign of that happening at the moment. I think there's an enormous amount of political and social confusion, and there's an enormous amount of poverty that is holding back some of the most splendid citizens we have.
Okay, so we'll wrap it up in about 5 minutes' time, so if you've got any more questions come in, send them in and we'll send them through. Agnes asked...
I'm late for my next appointment.
Maybe two minutes. What do you think of the... what do you think of people who like to live the life, the free gypsy life, and don't necessarily want to settle down in one particular place?
Well, great. I mean, my family come from Ireland, and something happened to me because I've been moving all my life. I've lived in, I think I worked it out, 165 different places, some very short and all that stuff. I'm one of those persons who is restless, and I think there's a lot of people out there who want to do it. All I would say is try and do it so that you're not harming the well-being of other people. There's always stories of people harming somebody, you know, going onto common land and leaving a load of mess behind. I think a lot of that is like all anecdotes, you know, you believe them and you don't believe them. All I know is that some of the people I've worked with are very peripatetic, is the other posh word. That's 3 posh words you got today.
I'm writing it down.
Peripatetic, mendicants. And I would say we should have a society that is broad enough, wide enough and sympathetic enough to cater for that. But at the same time, we should also cater for the people who want to stay exactly where they are and don't want to move and don't want people sticking their noses into their business.
Okay. Last question. So it's one of the latest issues of the big issue. It's got Eddie Izzard on the front.
Yes.
Issue inside. It's a bit ruffled, but there it is. The latest one has got Bagpuss on it. So I presume you've got an interview with Bagpuss?
I don't know who Bagpuss is, so who? Come on. Now, who's Bagpuss?
Children's character, Bagpuss.
Oh, that one.
Pink cat.
Sorry, I thought this was a new alternative to, you know, take that or give me that or whatever the latest group is. Yeah, we have some pretty weird interviews with people. We had an interview with Lego Man a few weeks ago. That was brilliant. All the kids in my life.
That must be an exclusive. Come on.
It was. I mean, he didn't say much.
How do you choose who you put on the front cover? Or
if you look at it this way, what we want to do is we want you to buy that magazine because it's full of a general interest, you know, something that there's something for everybody, so that the audience is large enough, so that the vendor can sell the paper easily, and it's not like, you know, pulling teeth. So we have interviews with all sorts of people. This really does cheese off a lot of people who are involved in social justice and around homelessness, because they say, oh no, it's all got to be about homelessness and all. If you go to some of the street papers in Europe, every week somebody looks a bit like you with a beard but with their hair a bit, and it's always about homelessness. And I always say, well, I wouldn't run a magazine like that, because that is only for and they don't sell a lot of copies. We sell hundreds of thousands of copies because people buy it because it's a kind of general, it's not going to beat you up. You don't open it and go, which is what, so, and that, you know, you're not going to be doing that too often, are you? And this is what happened with the street paper, Street News, the first street paper in the world, in Manhattan. It went like that. And then they went, and when I spoke to the readers, the people I knew in New York, why? And they said, well, because every copy seemed just one big piece of disaster. And I don't want that, you know.
Just very quickly, from a technological point of view, I've read a story about a vendor in Kent who has a way that you can pay for these via your card.
Yeah.
Well, from a technology point of view, very quickly, what's the future in your head?
Well, the future is you will be able to buy the magazine on your phone. You will be able to buy online, and you will be able to buy other publications that we're doing. We're doing a YouTube channel, and the way it works then is that we then take the vendors on to become content providers. They turn into town criers, they turn into reporters, call them what you want. So we say to them, you know, you can sell on the street, or you can be a content provider. You can be sitting in a safe Starbucks coffee house composing an interview that you've done, or you can be going out in the phone and interviewing the people in the street and saying, well, what do you think about this, that and the other? So I'm moving towards citizens journalism, which I think is a wonderful opportunity for our vendors to become, you know, what's it called, town criers and stuff like that.
Okay, good. Watch this space on this. John Bird, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
We'll buy you a new watch.
Yeah, well, I don't need a new watch. I just need a glass of water. Next time I do this.
We'll get you a glass of water.
Yeah.
Obviously, you mentioned Russell Brand interview coming up a week on Monday. We'll put John's comments towards him. We'll be interviewing various other people over the next couple of weeks. We'll put out on Twitter, Facebook, and Google Plus who they are and when you can tune in to watch them. But for now, John Bird, co-founder of The Big Issue, thank you very much for your time, and that's us. Goodbye.